and loving it. So how often do we get a chance to have a conversation about the future of any place on this 2,350-mile river, and say a conversation about fundamentally changing what it has been and what it could be? How often, as the river goes through its largest metropolitan area, and how often as it goes through a unit of the national park system, you get a chance to talk about rivers and redefine them in that way? And that's what this is really about. So, a little geographic context. In 2014, by an act of Congress directed the Corps of Engineers to close the Upper Santee Falls Lock on June 10th, 2015. And this is the tallest lock on the Mississippi River, and it straddles the St. Anthony Falls, the only major waterfall on the Mississippi River. And so when they closed this lock and dam, and it ended commercial shipping at the next two locks and dams downstream. And I show this image. Don't let the big yellow lines are the tall ones are Lock and Dam 2. The other three are St. Anthony, Lower St. Anthony, and Lock and Dam 1. And what I want you to notice about that image is that they're all the same. Those three bars are all the same. You close one lock and dam, you close all three. Because any boat that went through one had to go through lower and upper to get to a barge terminal, or vice versa coming downstream. So that really shows that they're all very, very connected. So the Corps wants to leave, Congress closed one, but they want to leave all three of the locks and dams. And I should ask you this, is there a camera I should be looking at somewhere?
It's behind you, actually.
We're just sharing yours.
We're sharing what's behind.
Okay.
It's just a screen.
Got it. Okay. I was like, where should I be looking? So the Upper Santee Falls Dam can't be disposed of in this disposition study that's underway because it's owned by Xcel Energy for the most part. Plus, if you took out the dam, St. Anthony Falls would go away. So we can't do that. But we have a choice what we do with the other two locks and dams, whether they remain or whether they stay. And that conversation is really just beginning. And the outcome is going to have profound consequences for the fish and wildlife of this river, for the recreation of this river, and it's going to have profound consequences for what MNRA is and could be. Removing the locks and dams would place a new emphasis that recreation and MNRA would become all capital letters. And I'll tell you more about that as we get further down the way on this. In 2018, American Rivers made removing these locks and dams as one of its national goals. They see this as a signature project that they could be engaged in. And they declared the gorge one of America's 10 most endangered rivers for the possibility that we wouldn't remove them and miss that opportunity. Others, like the rowing clubs and those who like reservoirs, they want the locks and dams to stay. And Brookfield Energy owns the power license at both Lower and at one, and they're going to have a big say in this conversation. So to choose between keeping these locks and dams and removing them requires knowing as much as possible about what that means and what the consequences will be. And MNRA's two key allies, the National Parks Conservation Association and Friends of the Mississippi River, haven't taken a position on it yet. There's just too many outstanding questions yet to say definitively what their role or what their position should be. What's in the sediment? How much sediment is there? Where is the sediment going to go? And I really see the locks and dams are the concrete and steel embodiment of past visions for the Mississippi River. The question really is, do we have the same visions as those people who wanted those locks and dams, or do we have a different 21st century vision of what we want this river to be? And then will we act on that and create the river that serves us best today? So I'm going to begin by building the context for this conversation. And the outcome of the Corps disposition study, that's what they call it, a disposition, meaning disposal study. They want to dispose of these locks and dams, is a choice between two very different worlds, both different from the world we know today. The world we know today, or we used to know today, is changing. That's a fact. There's going to be no more navigation through here. So a new world is coming. How are we going to define that? To better understand the geography of this conversation, I have to review the physical character of the Mississippi River and the Twin Cities. I've done this many times. Some of you have heard it. Some of you may not. Some of you may use it in your interpretation and education already. But I like to define the three Mississippis of the Twin Cities. The first Mississippi, the river enters the northern metro as a prairie river. There's no rock outcrop bluffs. There's not that big of islands. It's the prairie river. The prairie comes right up to the edges of it. The second reach is the gorge. In the gorge stretches, I gotta keep up here, Prairie River, Second reaches the gorge, and the gorge runs for 8.5 miles from St. Anthony Falls to the mouth of the Minnesota River. And this is the only place on the whole river where the Mississippi falls so steeply through such a tight, narrow canyon. It drops over 110 feet from above St. Anthony to below it, an 11-story building over 8.5 miles. The bluffs are 80 to 110 feet high. The river drops 49 feet at Upper St. Anthony, 26 feet at Lower St. Anthony, and 36 feet at Lock and Dam 1. For thousands of years, the gorge was the head of fish migration of the whole Mississippi. Fish to get up to the falls, and that was as far as they could get. Can you imagine the fish assemblage that would have been at St. Anthony Falls, 200 years ago? Can you imagine the variety of mussels and other aquatic life? The large floodplain river begins at the mouth of the Minnesota River and extends down the Gulf of Mexico. At the confluence, the big river begins. It's a river of what one writer called the river of image, myth, and metaphor, the river of Mark Twain. That's where the big river, the river of all these big side channels and backwaters and huge islands begins. It's a river most of us think about. The gorge then is this tiny, isolated little reach between the long Prairie River above and the large floodplain river below. But you can't measure its ecological significance or its recreational potential based on its length. And again, I'll show you how significant that is. So how do you compare what leaving the locks in place and dams in place would be to what taking them out would be? And I think you have to start by figuring out what was that natural river really like? And what of those things would emerge if we remove the locks and dams? So I'm going to start introducing you to some quotes and some stories from people who describe that natural river. Zebulon Pike is the first American explorer to come up the Mississippi River. On September 26, 1805, he leaves the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers and starts heading up the gorge. And he says it took him all day to get to St. Anthony Falls. And he got like at 4 or 5 in the morning. He was an early riser. It takes him all day to get to St. Anthony Falls. And he explains why. He said there was much labor in passing the rapids. Below St. Anthony Falls, he wrote, the river falls through a continued bed of rocks with a descent of about 50 feet over half a mile. There's almost one continued rapid aggravated by the interruption of a dozen small islands. Frustrated at their slow progress, he thought the entire gorge should be considered the Falls of St. Anthony. The rapids mentioned in this day's march, he argued, might properly be called a continuation of the Falls of St. Anthony, for they are equally entitled to this appellation as the Falls of the Susquehanna and Delaware. 12 years later, on July 16, 1817, Major Stephen Long, the second American explorer, comes up the gorge. And he says the rapids below the Falls of St. Anthony commence about 2 miles above the confluence. 2 miles above the confluence, where he saw the rapids beginning, and are so strong that we can hardly ascend them by rowing, poling, and having a sail up with a strong wind behind us. They get to about where the Marshall Avenue Lake Street Bridge is, he says, and they could no longer make any headway by all these means, and they're obliged to substitute the cordel in place of those other means. So they had to tie a rope around a tree and pull the boat up from tree to tree up the rest of the gorge because the river was so powerful and the rapids was so strong. So given its unique physical character, it was much different ecologically. I'm going to take you back a little further in time to 1766 when English colonist Jonathan Carver came to what is now the Twin Cities. And he says there were all kinds of eagles' nests on Spirit Island below the falls. And he said the reasons for all these eagles' nests were all the fish trying to migrate above the falls. So like you see the salmon spawning and imagine that kind of a view here of all these fish trying to migrate above the falls right in the heart of the Twin Cities today. In 1823, members of Stephen Long's second expedition ate bass at the falls and reported someone catching 142-pound catfish below the falls. So whether high or low, navigation was impossible or really difficult to get through the gorge. By the late 1850s, steamboats come and go over 1,000 times from St. Paul and only about 50 times from Minneapolis. And it's because of the gorge. And the voyage of the Fanny Harris helps us understand why. This is my image of the Fanny Harris coming down the gorge. Someone wants to make a better one, love it. So the Fanny Harris nearly sank in coming down the gorge, trying to make its way down the really very crooked channel, winding between reefs of solid rock with an 8 to 10 mile current. In coming down the gorge, The Fanny Harris had 2 wing rudders, and a rock knocked off one of the wing rudders. And they had a special rapids pilot. He panicked and left the wheel. And there were 2 older pilots behind him, and one of them got up and grabbed the wheel. And he said, had he not grabbed the wheel, the boat would have been smashed to kindlings. And they didn't tell the engineer in the boiler room because they needed him to keep feeding coal into the boilers because they said they needed a full head of steam to navigate their way through that current. Otherwise, it would have piled them up on the next reef below. For 6 miles, the writer said, they twisted among the reefs under a full head of steam, which was necessary to give a steerage way in such a current. Again, imagine that's the gorge at this time. All along the gorge at low water lay small pockets of floodplain, such as you see in this image. What I want you to think about is how physically and ecologically different the gorge must have been from what it is today. Structurally, you had the rapids, the sand and gravel bars, and the boulders. The river rose and fell with a natural pulse, which I'll show you a really good image of that in a little bit. And all of this would play a role in its ecological significance. Minneapolis, however, desperately wanted to be the head of navigation. They viewed themselves as the bookend to New Orleans, the commercial New Orleans of the Northern River. And that's what they wanted, but this river would not allow that. So was damming the gorge really necessary to make Minneapolis the head of navigation? I'm giving you some anecdotal accounts. What hard evidence do we have? Fortunately, the Corps of Engineers provides details in its annual reports on what the gorge was really like. On April 29th, 1890, a Corps survey crew boarded a skiff below St. Anthony Falls and headed downriver to assess, as the report says, the feasibility of improving navigation by the removal of rocks and boulders. According to their report, they found a very swift current for a greater part of the way down to Meeker Island in much rough water, indicating the existence of rocks and boulders. The least depth they found was 3 feet. That's 3 feet in April when the river's at its absolute highest. But there's only 3 feet of water. Meeker Island is an anchor point in the gorge, so you have to know where it is. It's about 3.5 miles below St. Anthony Falls and about 5 miles above the confluence. And the Marshall Avenue Bridge is another anchor point. I'll mention the Marshall Avenue Bridge a number of times. It's about the midway point of the gorge. And I call it the Marshall Avenue Bridge instead of the Lake Street Bridge, not in bias toward St. Paul, but because that's what the Corps of Engineers refers to it as in their annual reports. This was a point where Major Long had to go to Cortling the boat up the rest of the river. So imagine above the Lake Marshall Bridge, you got to cordle your way in a boat. Showing that small boats could venture up the gorge, the Corps reported that on May 1st, 1890, the steam launch Ada, which only drew about 2 feet, it said about 2 feet deep in the water. That's what a draw means. It drew 2 feet of water, and it made it to Minneapolis without much difficulty. But again, this was in the early spring when the water was at its highest. It was a different matter for larger boats, and I mean for any boat that drew more than 3 feet of water, it was going to be more difficult. And the General Barnard, this snag boat here, drew 39 inches. And so it comes up the gorge on June 26th, and it gets blocked at about Meeker Island because the current's too strong and there's too many boulders in the river. It can't get any further up the Mississippi. So based on the survey work and the Corps' attempts to navigate the gorge, we can break it into 4 distinct reaches. And I hope this helps you in your interpretation if you're talking to people and thinking about it. There's really 4 distinct reaches. The first reach was from St. Anthony Falls to the Minneapolis Steamboat Landing, which is about the University of Minnesota today, which is about a mile downstream. And this was the steepest and fastest reach. The second reach ran from the Minneapolis Boat Landing to the Marshall Avenue Bridge. And through this section, the Corps said, the bottom of the river is composed of boulders, mixed in places with coarse gravel, and then added, it may be likened to a street paved with rubble stones, so closely are the boulders packed. So I think that the riverbed is a boulder-packed street underneath the water. The lower limit of the boulders, the Corps said, is the Marshall Avenue Bridge. The third reach began at the bridge and extended down to about where Lock and Dam 1 is today. And what they found through this reach was there were smaller boulders, more coarse gravel and sand starting, but they're also starting to become bigger and bigger islands the lower in the gorge you went because the current's starting to slow. And so that sediment is aggregating into islands. The final reach is below where Lock and Dam 1 is today. And here the current really slows as it hits the Minnesota River. And so the islands are getting much bigger and you have a braided channel that's going into the confluence area. The Corps detailed for us what the natural structure and the character of the gorge was like then. And then they began dismantling it once they documented it. Between 1890 and 92, the Corps attempted to make the gorge navigable for steamboats, eliminating the structure of the gorge. In one place near Meeker Island, they found that they blew out 76 granite boulders. They're not granite, they were limestone. They called them granite this time. Clearly a geologist was not leading the Corps writing of this. The boulders range in size from 1.5 to 6 feet in diameter, and from some 4 to 8 feet by 15 feet on a side. So massive boulders are in the gorge at this time. With few exceptions, the engineer said, they blew them all up with dynamite. And if they couldn't, they hauled out of the river what they could, and then if there were still more rocks, they blasted those out. And so they completely eliminate this important physical character, important structural character for habitat as well from the gorge. Where they dredged the river, the Corps placed the material in side channels behind some of the existing islands. So now they're starting to fill in habitat and structure behind the islands, the few islands within the gorge. But the river slope through the upper gorge was just too strong and too steep. In his 1893 report, the Corps of Engineers headquarters, Major Alexander Mackenzie, offered an assessment of all the work the Corps had done. He said, with a channel now as existing of sufficient depth and free from obstruction, it was found by actual trial to be very difficult, if not impossible, for large boats to steam the current at its swifter portions of the rapids between Meeker Island and Minneapolis. In fact, the velocity of the current is such as to practically prevent profitable navigation. These big steamboats could not get into that gorge. It was so powerful above the bridge. Consequently, the Corps headquarters directed the Corps to do more surveys in anticipation of building locks and dams. And in 1894, Congress authorized the buildings of 2 locks and dams in the gorge. One of them's not upper or lower St. Anthony, is the Meeker Island Lock and Dam 1. Meeker is going to have a 13.9 foot left, and Lock and Dam 1 a 13.3 foot left. And this really plays into the rivalry between Minneapolis and St. Paul. Minneapolis desperately wanted to be the head of navigation, but they did not want St. Paul to get hydropower. They did not want competing mills below Minneapolis. So how do they win on that argument? Well, you get 2 low dams built. Neither capable of hydropower, but both will take navigation up to Minneapolis. And there's a great story behind that, which I don't have time for, but and there's an article, The Secret History of the Earliest Locks and Dams, which Minnesota History published. I think you guys should have access to that. Just as the Corps began working on the locks and dams, the Mississippi River Commission map makers reached the gorge, and they began this intensive mapping of the whole Mississippi River. The Mississippi River Commission right now is headquartered out of Vicksburg, and so they start mapping the Mississippi River in great detail. This section of the map, you guys can't see it in here very clearly, but there's like soundings across the river at every 1,000 feet, I think it is, or less, and it shows where there's bluff is clay, boulders, and gravel, and so they're detailing. These map makers are detailing exactly what the gorge looks like. As the Corps began planning for locks and dams, actually, I want to show you one other slide. Again, it's hard for you all to see this. And online, you'll be able to start looking at these larger islands within the lower part of the gorge. Again, so now they're mapping, showing us the structure, the physical character of the gorge. You combine this with their written descriptions, along with these maps and some of the photographs we have, you can really see how different things are. So as the Corps began planning for locks and dams, a new force began motivating damming the gorge, and would eventually reverse plans for having 2 low dams and locks and dams in the gorge. In 1881, a consortium of millers and others formed the Minnesota Brush Electric Company. It's a small hydroelectric plant. They ran lines to bars and businesses. On September 5th, 1882, they lit them with electricity generated from the first commercial hydroelectric central plant in America. So this is the beginning of hydroelectricity in America commercially at St. Anthony Falls. In 1895, the Pillsbury Washburn Company completed the Main Street station at Hennepin Island. In 1897, the company finished the lower hydro station and dam below St. Anthony Falls at Lower St. Anthony Falls. And so this structure is going to permanently flood the river from Lower St. Anthony up to the falls, where fish used to start migrating up, trying to get above the rapids, above the falls. Now they had to try to get above the dam at Lower St. Anthony. These projects demonstrated the potential for hydroelectric power in the gorge. And some people thought we'd really missed a huge opportunity to have a high dam within the gorge. and they start lobbying to get that high dam in. In 1907, however, the Corps completed the Meeker Island Lock and Dam and had begun building Lock 1. They spent over $1 million on this project. How could they go backwards and go to a high dam? But they would not. In 10, Congress authorized a new project for the gorge, and it requires taking out the Meeker Island Lock and Dam. They're going to take Lock and Dam 1 from a 13.3 foot left to a 36-foot left, which will create that hydropower potential. So in 1911, the Corps begins blowing up the top 5 feet of the dam at Meeker Island, chopping it apart with pickaxes. They take the gates off the lock and walk away and just abandon the site. In 1917, they completed Lock and Dam 1, replacing the rapids above with a reservoir. So now 6.3 miles of the gorge is a reservoir. There's only just a little bit left below his dam. And in 1924, the Ford Motor Company will build a hydroelectric station on this plant, or open the hydroelectric station plant on Lock and Dam 1. One other dam flooded the last portion of the gorge. In 1930, the Corps will open Lock and Dam 2 about 32 miles downriver, and that will flood the gorge all the way up to Lock and Dam 1. So now, as of 1930, the entire gorge has become reservoirs. That natural rapids is gone by 1930. But for Minnesota, or Minneapolis, to be the head of navigation of the Mississippi, you have to get above St. Anthony Falls. Because above St. Anthony Falls, it's the Prairie River, right? You can spread out. You can have all kinds of businesses up there, and you can have a port terminal up there as well. So in 1930, Congress authorized the 9-foot channel project under which the Corps would build locks and dams 3 through 26. But they didn't include anything for Minneapolis. So Minneapolis started lobbying even harder. In 1937, Congress authorizes the Upper Harbor Project, under which you can build Lower St. Anthony Falls Lock and Dam and Upper St. Anthony. So Lower is completed in 1956, and in 1963, the Corps completes the Upper Lock at St. Anthony. So now Minneapolis is connected to New Orleans with a really good navigation system. Now they got their chance to become the bookend to New Orleans. But that dream just never came true. By 2000, grain traffic had left the gorge. And by 2010 and after, there's less than 3 million tons of commerce moving through the gorge. 3 million tons is kind of the benchmark of how much you need to make it justifiable. And it's less than 1 million tons in the last few years of this operation. So in 2014, Congress mandated the permanent closure of the upper lock. And while many people think it closed because of invasive carp were just the trigger. Many times in history, you have underlying causes, and then you have triggers. The underlying causes here were the failure of navigation and the fact that Minneapolis had these visions for the Upper Harbor Terminal, 144 acres, I think it is, or 44 acres, that could be much, much, much better used economically than it was being used for. And so Minneapolis doesn't oppose the closure of the upper lock. So this image here is the accumulation of all the pollution that's coming into the gorge. So you can't read it, of course, but just look, it's like just a build up of all the pollution that's coming into the gorge. And had the water quality of the gorge been pristine, the locks and dams still would have a profound negative impact on the aquatic ecosystem of the river. But this was like, pollution will be like the meteor hitting the dinosaurs. It is going to finish off all aquatic life in the gorge. By 1917, when the Corps finished Lock and Dam 1, all but one of Minneapolis's sewers and 13 of St. Paul's emptied into the Mississippi and the gorge, delivering 65 million gallons of sewage a day into the gorge. The decomposing organic matter sucked all the oxygen out of the water, and no fish or other aquatic life could hardly live in the Mississippi River. In 1930, Judson Wicks, the president of the Minnesota Isaac Walton League, estimated that the Twin Cities sewers put 144 million gallons of sewage into the Mississippi each day. That's how much left the Twin Cities. When the river flowed at its low water level, 5.8 gallons of water had to dilute 1 gallon of sewage. You can imagine what that smelled like. The pollution should have been no surprise to Clarence Yonk when he launched the Betsy Nell's awkward houseboat into the gorge in 1933. And he captures the pollution way better than I think any statistics does. The Betsy Nell, he wrote, has been lowered into the sewage-laden water where fish dive, bloat, and turn idly about in the eddies, showing their worm-infested bodies like a curse to the men who infected their world. Continuously, their white mouths nudge the manure of humanity, the offwash of the streets and gutters. And here, curling under our starboard side, of brown foam bubbles and steams. Such is our baptism into the great river. Below Lock and Dam 1, the Twin Cities relied on the Mississippi just to carry away all their pollution. They could just let the people downstream deal with it. But when the Corps completes Lock and Dam 2 in 1930, it backs up, builds up, and keeps all that pollution at home. By the mid-1930s, there's no aquatic life hardly left in Pool 2 above Hastings. And there's large mats of sewage, just and organic matter floating over much of the surface of the Mississippi River. Some say that the stench from the river with a good south wind was just wafting right up to the Capitol as they're debating a sewage treatment plant and spurs the legislature to authorize the building of a sewage treatment plant. 1934, the Corps or the city breaks ground on the Twin Cities broke ground on the Pig's Eye sewage treatment plant and opened it 4 years later. It only conducted primary treatment. Primary treatment took about 50% of the pollutants, but it still made a big difference. Within 2 months, those large mats started to disappear from the river. Within a couple of years, fish started coming back. The plant would continue into new generations of treatment. Today, where it treats the vast majority of the pollutants coming in are treated before they leave the plant. In 1972, the Clean Water Act addressed industrial and point source pollution, making the Mississippi River even better. And then in 1985, Minneapolis began and St. Paul began the sewer separation project. Because what happened when the river, when we had big rains, it would flood into the sewers, and then that would flood into storm sewers, and that would go in the river because they were combined in places. So they started separating them. And what this joke says, it's nice to have a clean river again. The water's great. It's the eagles I'm worried about now, because they can actually see in the river and fish are coming back. In about the late 1980s, mayfly hatches in the metro areas have really taken off, indicating a much healthier river. So the fish that repopulated the gorge have largely adjusted to the new system, the new environment that they're living in. And it's kind of reached a plateau from which it can go no higher and maybe actually will go down inside these pools in the river. And don't try it, read this. This is a table of 4 surveys between 1982 and 2023 of the gorge by the DNR, Department of Natural Resources, and it tells what fish they caught. The interesting thing, so 1982, 1995, 2009, and then in 2023, we got or 2022, we got the DNR to do a baseline study as kind of anticipating what happens if the dams are removed. And this is the most robust study anybody's done. But in all these surveys, they only found 10 to 26 species. There's a 1963 study that says there should be 123 species in the river here, in the contiguous waters of Minnesota, in Wisconsin. And like the total number of fish captured over all 4 years was 241 of smallmouth bass. That was the biggest number that they caught. Common carp were the next biggest number. But what you see is, below this point, it's 25 or less fish between all 4 studies that they've caught. So most of the fish are catching are there, and it's very, very small numbers, which indicates it's not a very robust fishery. There's only a few species that are still fairly strong in those waters. So the DNR then, well, they were going to do a telemetry study and look at fish in the gorge, how do fish move back and forth in the gorge. And they started that in 2013, we're planning it, but then 2015, the lock closed. So now they shift, let's look downriver with this telemetry study. So they begin this telemetry study and they want to put sensors in paddlefish and sturgeon, but they can't find any in the pool 1. They wanted one from pool 1 because they know they might migrate back there, but they couldn't find any. They found one of each in pool 2, and so they put tags on those and let them go. And they found that the lake sturgeon traveled between pools 2 and 3 and up the St. Croix River. So it's moving through locks and dams. Paddlefish spent most of its time in the Minnesota River. It actually went 200 miles up the Minnesota River. So these are moving long distance, big fish moving long distances, but they did not go through lock and dam 1. So they're staying out of there. Common carp and bigmouth buffalo, however, went through the lock and dam much more often. So the limited findings fit with Luther Odland, a DNR biologist, reported for the DNR in this report he did called Barrier Effects on Native Fishes in Minnesota. He found that most often the fish present in reservoirs were habitat generalist, species tolerant of all kinds of conditions, and ones that were actually stocked by the DNR that accounted for them being there. Intolerant species, stream-dependent species, and imperiled or threatened species were the least commonly found fish above dams. Bluesucker, moon-eye paddlefish, sauger, and shovel-nosed sturgeon were among 27 species absent upstream of all assessed barriers, but they were present even when they were present elsewhere within the watersheds of those streams. None of these fish were caught in the gorge surveys. And as expected, Odland says, species known to migrate long distances, large body fishes were among those most likely absent or extirpated above the dams in Minnesota. The gorge is changing since the end of navigation. The Corps has stopped dredging. Pool 1 is starting to fill in and level out across the pool. The river is redefining its bed. Lock and Dam 1 in Lower St. Anthony Falls, the locks open less frequently. There's less traffic coming through because the Corps is taking it down to about the lowest level of navigation use that they can take it down to. If the locks and dams remain, the two pools will likely become isolated stretches of river, because if some new owner is not going to want to operate a lock and a dam and pay for it. So they'll probably keep those lock gates closed. So any fish migration that was happening is going to stop. And so these pools are going to become very isolated ecosystems. Mussels might benefit from the fact that there's no commercial navigation, there's no boats stirring up their habitat, but a lot of those mussels depend on fish to be transported. And if the fish go away, the mussels are going to decrease as well. Water quality could be about the same as it is right now, but the gorge is impaired for bacteria. So that's something to consider. In contrast, what would dam removal mean? What fish would become resident species within the gorge and which would come and go? The Lower St. Anthony Falls pool has the steepest drop on the entire Mississippi River. It's a 26-foot drop over just over a quarter to a half of a mile, which means there's going to be this really robust rapids flowing there. Fish would have to want to really get up into that habitat, maybe to spawn. The Corps drew down pools, the upper pool in 2008 and 2020. This is what it looked like naturally. This is what it looks like in the 2020 drawdown. And these events give us a hint of what that river might look like in the uppermost part of it. Pool 1 has only seen one drawdown in my time that I've known of. It happened in 2007 for help with a 35W bridge collapse. They lowered Pool 1 by only 5 feet. And by only lowering 5 feet, we still saw these images within the gorge. These large boulders are still there despite the Corps' efforts to blow them up. There's still a lot of those. We found islands forming around the pier at Lake Street Bridge like there used to be historically. And so there's side channel sandbars really started coming out from the shore. So we know that structure's there. It could come back. They only took it down 5 feet. Remember, it can go down 36 feet. And we have lots of historic images of what the gorge used to look like. So historically, there were more islands at the lower end where the river leveled out. Those bigger islands of braided channel happened. But if you take out Lock and Dam 1, Pool 2 will extend almost a mile into Pool 1. So when that river, that fast-moving river hits the lower part of the gorge, it's going to hit that backwater of Lock and Dam 2 and slow down and drop even more sediment. So the islands could be just as big or bigger as the river tries to find a way through them at the end of the gorge. So have in your mind really powerful rapids in the upper part, and then a braided channel, slow-moving river at the bottom part of the gorge. Below the Marshall Avenue Bridge, it's going to be a fast-flowing river until it hits that backwater effect. And you have to consider this image. You can't read the numbers, so I'm not even going to tell you not to read them. What I want you to notice is the colors on this map. This is a map of the mean flow at the Anoka gauge. And what it shows you is 11 miles above St. Anthony Falls. So really, it's a good measure of how much water comes over St. Anthony Falls and then flows through the gorge. And it's from June 1931 to September 2020. I want to update it with the more recent years. But the oranges indicate 5,000 or less. The darker the color, the less the water. The light blues indicate flows over 15,000 cubic feet per second. The darker the color, the more flow. What do you see here in terms of January, February, March, April, May, June? This is the year. Look at the seasonality of that water. That seasonality is obliterated by a large part by the locks and dams. You don't notice it, do you? let's go right down to Lock and Dam 1 and see the water flowing over. If there were no locks and dams, that seasonality would be, you could float down. You'd better be a whitewater raft or kayaker in this, like in a really high spring. You could float down in an inner tube in the fall, stopping at one of those dozen or 20 islands or more, take out at Hidden Falls or at the park's new headquarters at Watergate Marina when it's built. So think of how dramatic that difference is. So the basic structure of the gorge is still there. And it's clear from dam removal studies around the country in Minnesota that diversity of fisheries is going to come back. The number of intolerant species that are threatened and other species that rely on free-flowing rivers would begin coming back. In DNR's studies of dam removals in Minnesota, they offer a really great example or indication of what could come back. According to Luther Odland's study of 11 dam removals in Minnesota, 66% of species not present above those dams came back within the first few years. 66%. So think of the diversity that could come back. The Minnesota River Basin has the longest, the Minnesota River Basin has the longest stretch of free-flowing river in Minnesota. You can go from the confluence up to Granite Falls, a 240-mile long stretch of free-flowing river. And Odland says there's over 98 native species in that river. So those species could easily go up to the gorge, spawn on the rock rapids and gravel back rapids and go back up to Minnesota or go down. And it also connects to critical habitat. We know that those long sturgeon and paddlefish went into St. Croix. They went down to through Lock and Dam 2, through Lock and Dam 3, maybe down to St. Croix. So those big fish are going to probably come back and start spawning in the gorge as well. And so these are all the other species that American Rivers has done an infographic for that think that lots of other species are going to come back into the gorge. More fish would mean more eagles nesting along the gorge, most likely, especially with spawning events that could happen there. How many other species would benefit? Fast flowing water oxygenates itself, killing bacteria. And so it would be much cleaner river. It would probably end the bacteria impairment in the gorge, having a free flowing river. And consider the recreational use and change potential. Today, I mean, if you've been out of the gorge, Forrest isn't here. I know he did the study with the core of the recreation in the gorge. There's not a lot of recreation in the gorge, and there's going to be a lot less because the locks are going to be closed more and more. And especially if they stay and are taken over by someone, a private entity, they're probably not going to open at all. It's probably pretty good for the U of M rowing club and the Minneapolis rowing club. They kind of got it to themselves right now. But if you ever notice how many people fish below Lock and Dam 1 down to Hidden Falls versus how many people you see fishing along the shore above, that would extend all the way up the gorge. It was a free-flowing river. And then I love this. When I was, I had to go to a superintendent's academy training class in Boise, Idaho at the Interagency Fire Center. Came in on Sunday, it was 105 degrees. We went down to this park along the river. And we saw all these people floating by through the trees. And we're going, what is that? And we found a bridge and looked up and we saw this. People floating down the Boise River. Over 100,000 people float the Boise River in Boise, Idaho each year. I talked to the director of Ada County Parks, which is a county there, and they said in the first 6 weeks, a couple of years ago, the rental company made $1.6 million in rental equipment, and most people out there have their own equipment. Boise is now advertising, come visit Boise, come float the Boise River. Come live in Boise, because you can have this urban recreation right in the heart of the Twin Cities. And I love this map. You can't read it again. It's too small, but you start actually at this end. You float by all these parks like we have, like Hidden Falls, Gorge Regional Park. Then you come to Boise State University, like the University of Minnesota. Then you come to downtown Boise. Downtown University, Natural Gorge. About 6 miles long in Boise. Almost identical. I'm waiting for someone to fund me to go visit Boise again, because it's a great example of what this river could be. If Boise could put 100,000 people on the river a year, how many do you think we could put on the river a year? That's why I said at the beginning of this, what would MNRA be with that much recreation? How much time how much more funding would we need to get people out there to interpret that river, to make it safer, to educate people about the gorge if you've got 150 to 200,000 people wanting to recreate in that gorge each year. It would fundamentally define the nature of this park, I think. So this is the conversation we're having right now is what vision is going to play out. We're going to keep the dams and what that future means, or we're going to get rid of them and create a different future. The Corps disposition study is proceeding fairly slowly. The Corps got about $2 million to do disposition studies around the country. And they're divvying out to the St. Paul district a small piece of that, which means the Corps is not spending a lot of time. And so it's taking a lot longer than we thought. National Parks Conservation Association and others are trying to push Congress to fund the study at a higher level that haven't succeeded yet. The Corps is doing some borings. They've done the borings, we hope, that will tell what's in the sediment and how much sediment there is. Friends of the Mississippi River, along with the National Parks Conservation Association, McAllister College, University of Minnesota, and American Rivers, we have a regular meeting every couple of weeks to talk about how to keep this study going. Also, what studies could we do that they're not doing, that we're not going to do at the level we think they should be done? How can we get funding to do those studies? And one of those is a Legislative Citizens Commission on Minnesota Resources grant process where the University of Minnesota's St. Anthony Falls Laboratory has made it through the first stage. And if they make it through the next stage, then over the next 2 years, beginning in July of next year, they would look at the sediment and they would model the sediment in the lab and see where is that sediment going to go, how's it going to move, what's the course going to look like if we take those dams out. So that could be a fascinating interpretation opportunity, is take people over to the lab and show them the model once it gets built. So I'm going to stop there, at least about 15 minutes for questions, Q&A. Yeah, question about this or the cutoff wall, get an update on that too. Okay.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, Chris.
What if we left the lock gates permanently open?
You left the lock gates permanently open, but left the dams in place.
Yep.
Then all it'd be like creating one island in the river, and all the channel would go around that one. And so all the scour patterns would follow from leaving those in place. So the water's going to go. I should have thrown it in. There's a great picture of a sand table. Have you ever seen a sand table like in this Science Museum? We used to have them. Other science museums have them. And you let the water start going through the sand and it starts finding its own little rut.
Mhm.
But now if it hits a block, it's going to go to wherever the opening is.
Sure.
So the dams would be the opening. At lower, St. Anthony Falls, not much sediment stays in that pool. It's too steep. It's too fast. It would just start accumulating in pool one in certain places, and lock one to become a funnel, a fire hose and then it would scour like crazy downstream of it as well. So you have to, one thing you have to recognize, you have to design a removal. I had mentioned that in here, is that how much are we gonna let this river find its own way and how much are we gonna have to design it to keep it where it should be going? Yeah.
There's one from online from Pete. Any lessons learned from the Klamath River dam removal process that would relate to mist?
I'm not familiar enough with the Klamath dam removal process or the Elwha or some of those others. The St. Anthony Falls Lab is, and it's I think it's probably a bigger dam, a higher dam removal. But I know there's a clear one that in the Northwest Coast that the lab actually did the modeling for the removal, and there's a video of the removal, and they were surprised at how fast the sediment went out. And it's going out into a coastal setting in this case, which they want to build estuaries. When they removed the Elwha Dam, like I said, you have to design the removal so it does what you want it to. It started cutting under some roads. It cut out some roads and it started putting sediment in different places. So to be honest, I don't know enough about the Klamath. One of the things I was trying to find out is trying to find dam removals that aren't on coastal rivers, because it's hard to find the ones that aren't on coastal rivers that don't have salmon or shad or go into an estuary, create an estuary.
We have a question from Allie. What do you envision would happen to the area known near what was once known as Watergate Marina? Would that area dry up?
The Watergate Marina area, would probably stay very similar to what it is today. I mean, they're not going to let this, like on those coastal ones, like Klamath, they can let that sediment go if it's going right into the ocean. The navigation industry is not going to allow another grain of sand into pool 2 that they have to dredge out. So and there's other concerns for filling in Lake Pepin. The Lake Pepin Alliance doesn't want Lake Pepin filling in any faster. The Prairie Island Indian community does not want their harbor filling with sediment. So sediment's a big issue here. How that sediment moves and where it goes is really critical. So we have to figure that out before we can do anything.
When's the Corps gonna release the information that they got from the coring samples from last year? Any thoughts on that or?
Yeah, like April of this year.
Okay.
We're still waiting for it. It's being delayed probably because they don't have enough money for people to work on it. I was hoping it'd be sooner. And of course, I got that recreation study. I'd love to see that recreation study. But again, it's a very limited recreation study. I think right now the Corps can't just study what recreation there is. You have to look at the recreation potential here. Like I say, the Boise River is such a close model to what we have. If we had removed these dams, I think we would put over more than 100,000 people on the river a year.
I have a question. If
Yeah.
it were decided to actually remove like Locking Dam 1, how would that dismantling actually once like dynamite? Is it like maybe rerouting so that part dries up and it's dismantling piece by piece?
So those are the studies that we need to have done. That's why the St. Anthony Falls lab, if they get the funding to do this modeling of the gorge and what will happen, it will be on a coastal river where the water's going right into the ocean for the most part. It's not affecting navigation or other things. You can blow it up or just take it out. The one I started preaching and here to feel you bleed it many years, or how do you keep it within a lot of it's in the core just it's like pull to him. We have them all. Part done. Just structures. For in the phase, but okay, we will all new study, all that, all just going to be
from the what sample.
Yeah. So I've been doing tree. I learned about it. That's really helping. I've mapped Iranian structure. Can't believe. I think I've got 18 substructures. Remember about river had about October 69. The wooden roof work under it. Must have filled on top of and put gravel inside. We're doing it. Ultrasound. Different. We've done penetrating. We've done analysis of channel analysis. These are like from earthquake. One is more line, the other is that. Different. Did that with a bar engine contract, and then we just had to get on the river and the ground did get also. I test these two tests. This is the biggest project is the testing. We have already that the risks really happen. I'm waiting on that.
No, no. The politically look like the answer.
It's a political like. I McAllister, a bunch of survey, bunch of education with other organizations that we want to. I think what we're realizing is that it's all questions like during those surveys we're saying this river is going to be so wild and flowing wild part of the city and drown. It's really dangerous to address the fear and convince people this is not something to be. And that could be a different issue. I have an answer to it. What's in the sediment? I remember people saying, the Gulf of Mexico, there's so much toxic material in that sediment. But that doesn't matter whether you think that's true or not. You have to address what's in the sediment. What kinds of materials and how do you deal with that? And how much sediment is there and where it's going to go? Who's going to be responsible for safety in the gorge? Is it going to be law enforcement? What's going to happen to the neighborhoods? Should be parking along every street, around the fairground or something, because it's so popular. How do you handle parking and access? So any one of those issues could be a political stop if it's not handled well. That's what we wanted at ECA. Others are trying to get all the studies done we need to anticipate the objections. Yeah.
What extent are climate change impacts being considered as part of these studies? Because there's significant flooding already this summer. I mean, and like will be in future years to come too. So how are they accounting for things like that?
The image I showed of this one, next couple of years in, but then she starts showing climate change. And so if you look at the top, you see all the orange. That's because I talked to a friend of mine, the Corps, they're still headwaters cams at times. That's not a true reflection of the season. Or this year, well, I can go into the levels. And I think, and then I had the year out. So to look how does climate change, how you towards or left, sort of erratic, and what is it? In structure. The University of Minnesota is west side. What within the core? The climate change. So the falls lab and to their modeling.
Question. Are you up in the Kinnick River dam removal project?
I don't understanding sure.
Support for doing it for 26. I was just wondering if there's is there.
If they've got a course probably shared. Some benefited.
Yeah.
So I have to look at that.
But they're similarly, they can have more action. Smaller. I'm surprised that you have about how you're going to handle or recreating in. Yeah, that'd be great, Rob. But my second part, it's like how realistic are you that this is actually 10 years?
Yeah, I'm gonna hide. I prefer to see the dams. I'd love to see it restored to a natural river. I can just imagine a fishery, recreation, how it would raise this national park profile. I think it's very realistic because you want to pay millions of dollars a dam that serves small hydroelectric needs for the next 50 years, or would you have a one-time cost taking them out? And then no agency is responsible for maintaining it at that point. So I think the long-term economic benefit is to say, get rid of them. or you have dam failure, they quit taking care of it, they quit maintaining it. So I'm optimistic that we'll get the dam removal. I just toured the Flint Hills solar panel project. It's over 350 acres, but it's a 44 megawatt solar panel facility they're putting in. There'll be a third of the Flint Hills that they are planning down there, third of their power is coming from solar. The total power of these two locks and dams, one is about 18 megawatts, one is about 9 megawatts, 27 megawatts. Solar and wind in 10 years are going to replace that energy to clean. If people, I want to remind people, hydroelectricity is not green energy. It's renewable, but it destroys environments by damming rivers. So if we engage solar and wind, I think it'll be better.
I was really struck by your whole focus on recreation and envisioning, you know, what could be, what this could become, especially comparing it to the people that use the reservoir now, which is very few, like just the rowing clubs. Yeah. But I'm just wondering, you know, you mentioned after the fall. And, okay, so what goes
Down in the spring, yeah, and then float it.
Yeah.
People on the Boise River.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, in those high waters, ICS, do you know how deep the smaller channel will be in high water and the water area? Yeah.
So the actual front of the gorge, that's going to be designed by some engineer. Interview, which is a major dam removal private design company, is at right next to McAllister. And I've been talking to them. They're very interested in this project. It costs almost as much as removal as design a build. Then design this removal in a way that addresses, you know, I'm surprised I was asked about the ground. Because that dam is still there. It's just being metal now and concrete across the river floor. And this the river is cutting back that sand table sediment back out river. It'll get to meet the dam or dam remains. It'll bring waterfall. That's there. That's going to be addressed too. So, so you're going to design what kind of river flows in, or you put boulders in, or you have to put ripper up to ensure the shore is on a road. You know, long design.
It's gonna be pretty manicured.
Pretty yeah. In climate change, when that manicure and difficult, you can consider it. Yeah, it was flows up in the it's like 43, 43, 42, 41. We had a flow of 66 meters for the month. So we had a flow of 66,000 cubic feet per second in the last spring, the highest on record. The record is over 95 plus cubic feet per second. Nothing comes close to that. That's 1965. Imagine 95,000 cubic feet per second flowing through the gorge.
Okay, we got thinking about visitor use and comment on degree to which a massive increase in visitor usage on what would be a smaller / shallower water body compared to today would conflict with the goals of restoring fishing for mussel populations.
I think that's going to be the hardest thing. The hardest thing to balance is all the species that want to come back to this gorge and use it for habitat versus all the humans who want to use it for recreation. How do we balance and have that conversation of use? There's a seasonality where it's closed for 3 weeks. A key migratory season or spawning season. These are a big issue. We're going to have a conversation. That's why I said at the beginning, this conversation has just begun. The fundamental question is: do you want the river that people in the past gave to us, or do you want a river that we give to ourselves in the way we want? So that's the conversation we have.
What our park currently would have the authority to do anything like what the Croy does, right? Which if it's on the shut down, they say for the next 2 weeks or whatever, they could put that out there. And of course, yeah, they do stuff. Like that.
Yeah, so you might, especially if you don't get water out that river at 6,000 cubic feet per second. hell of a ride. Right. People come from around the region and do that in whitewater kayak at Stretch River. What about the pollution? What about the beer cans? What about the safety? All these issues. And then who's gonna run for law enforcement? St. Croix says law enforcement.
I'm saying it'd be different.
Which the federal government say it's a great national resource, great national opportunity. We're gonna give them in the budget and have law enforcement
Right.
and our rangers out there to help people. And I think that's one of the, in particular, the Mississippi River Visitor Center and rangers along the gorge. These are the conversations we can start having with people and kind of getting a sense of what are they thinking, what are their fears, what do they know, what they don't know. And start getting a handle on it because we can do this for 10 years as it evolves.
That's all we have.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, back to the roots of this stuff.
Yeah.
But it's